Listen up.
Welcome to the PowerShell Podcast, the podcast for PowerShell and the PowerShell community. And now, here's your host, Andrew Plaw.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the PowerShell Podcast. Very exciting interview with a friend of mine in store for you today. But first, let me give you a couple resources from amongst the community that I'd like to share. First of all, we have a cool blog post from Tony Redmond about transferring reusable PowerShell objects between Microsoft 365 tenants. Followed with a mastering time in PowerShell, measures statistical properties within time spans with PS dates. And that is by Matthew Doust. And if you haven't heard of it, psweekly.doust.dev is the link that you should be checking out regularly if you want to keep up with everything that's happening in the PowerShell community, whether that's new PowerShell podcast episodes, videos, upcoming events, and more. Well, let's get into the real meat and potatoes of this episode, and that's going to be my interview with a friend of mine that I've known for a while, seen him grow up in this PowerShell community. That is none other than Micah Shonyo. Micah, welcome to the podcast, man.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, man. So we've known each other for a little bit here, huh?
Yeah, but we're getting close to 1 full year.
Is that when we first met?
I probably joined the Discord and started interacting with people and early December-ish, and that's when people started to notice and then went from there.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about that. So this is the PDQ Discord that we met on maybe a year ago?
Yep. So I've been a deploy and inventory user for well over a year now that my boss, revealed to me that I had it as an option. And during the webcast, Andrew, you had shared the link to the Discord, and it's like, let's do it. See what I can do. Play around, meet some nerds, brainstorm and things like that. And there we are. We're now everywhere.
Nice. Yeah, and for those that don't know, every single Thursday, myself and some other people on my team, we put together a webcast. We've been doing it for, I don't know, maybe it's been going on for like 8 to 10 years or something, very long time. Back whenever I was a PDQ customer, I was watching this. And we have a pretty awesome group of people who checks us out every single Thursday. And you're one of those people. And I think maybe a year or two ago, we launched a Discord. We kind of had one, but we made it public. It's sort of a community space. And it's been really cool to have that sort of, I consider it more like a group of friends that are kind of growing with each other. But to have that Discord where we can grow outside of just using products, right? Like it for me, back whenever I was a customer PDQ stuff, it was an excuse to automate a bunch of what I had going on, but also from the content that PDQ did, I was able to learn a lot of other skills and sort of grow as a sysadmin, and that's sort of what we try and do there. And it's been very cool to see your growth process, and a lot of that growth revolves around PowerShell.
Oh, yes. PowerShell, the greatest tool there could ever be.
So when did you first get exposed to PowerShell?
So, shortly after reaching around 18 or so, my father, being a teacher, or not really being a teacher, but showing me the world of IT or whatever, going to work with him, whatever, started using a bit of PowerShell, and he started exposing me to it. So I started playing around with it. Then I got put on the shelf for a little bit, and then when I got the job that I have now, I've had to use PowerShell a lot. So my growth of PowerShell has just grown exponentially from that moment onwards.
And how's that journey been? Because that's sort of what I'm interested in learning about. As someone who's newer to the IT space, younger person, what is the impression of PowerShell for that type of person? Right? Have you known about it being a very powerful tool for a while, and you knew that, like, hey, I'm just going to spend some time here and get better, and it's going to add value, or what was that?
So yeah, my father, exposing me to it was like, this is a very nice tool that you should start learning. So I started toying around with it as I do. But when you're starting out, it's just like every other language. You're staring at a wall, figuring out where do you begin. So I kind of put it on the back burner until I discovered that, hey, I need to accomplish a task. What's the best tool to accomplish this task? And it happened to be PowerShell, and took me 10 minutes to make something that would run for several months for some reason.
Yeah. So did you know programming languages before PowerShell? Maybe a little Python or anything during school?
No, so I was not one of those kind of programming kind of people in high school or whatever. So I never did any programming classes. at the end of my high school is when I started to get exposed to PowerShell. So what I learned from just even that in college, I had to take a Python programming class. So all the structures and all the things that PowerShell does transferred almost seamlessly to Python. And so that built a good foundation where when I came back to PowerShell, I just learned what I had done in Python in a way easier way.
Yeah. And that is nice that a lot of these patterns, especially with object-oriented languages, there's a lot of similarities that you can borrow. And I think that, I was in a similar boat where I think it was C++ class in college, which was not the most fun. But there were a couple things here and there. I learned about variables, learned about comparisons that I was able to, I guess, slightly get me helping with the whole PowerShell thing. But it's cool that you have an opportunity at work where you can actually do stuff with PowerShell and learn by doing, sort of. And I want to talk about learning by doing because just observing you, it seems like that's your preferred way. You are down to go head first, bite off more than maybe a normal person would think they could chew, and just get it done. So what are some things that you've run across that have been really good excuses for you to dive deeper into PowerShell and expand your skills?
So with the place I work at, we use Hyper-V failover. So I was trying to learn, hey, how do I auto create VMs in states that I needed to? So Microsoft does provide a PowerShell module to interface with your failovers or whatever, but there were some parts that were missing. Like in the GUI of the console, you can find like the system free memory and the CPU utilization, but in PowerShell, unless it's buried deeply in a random command, there was no simple named commandlet to go get that information. So I wrote my own little module here that takes parts of that failover, splice it, does the logic it needs to go and get that kind of information. Because if you're trying to make VMs on like an enterprise scale, you probably want to know which node or which server node is your best pick for creating a new one on in case it starts load balancing. So you need to know, is my free physical memory about to be gone, or is my CPU on this one node running really high? So I had to make those kind of things. So when you do have PowerShell make your Hyper-V VMs, it knows where to throw them.
So that sounds like a pretty expansive. And you've published that on GitHub, right?
Yep, it is ms-cluster, the totally unofficial expansion of the Microsoft failover cluster module.
That's exciting. So that was, I think you made that like 5 or 6 months ago.
Yeah.
And sort of a good experience there. What were some of the things you learned along the way, or what were some of the hurdles? Because was that your first actual module you put together?
Yep, so that was the first actual module I'd ever made. So I was just diving head deep in. So there were obviously some limitations on how do I get system memory? How do I get volume information? How do I get the CPU clock seconds and then make it a percentage? And then how do I store it and display it to the user? How do I get all of these things working together without, causing the wall of red?
And how did you know how to put your module together? Like, what made you even think to do a module versus a script?
So with the initial creation of it was when I was, planning to build like a scaler for friends or whatever. And I was doing a lot of the same repetitive PowerShell. So instead of making it one big PowerShell script that just loads all the functions, I decided it'd be better to make it one module that then loads everything else it needs. And
But
so that
that's
way you can
wise.
keep it in your PowerShell window.
But like, how are you so wise? Have you heard other people talk about modules and like, hey, that's probably the appropriate method? How did that get implanted in your noggin?
It was more just like I was getting kind of annoyed with having one big script file and making it really hard to maintain one massive script file. So it's like, how can I make this a little better? And then with experience of other modules like PS Windows updates or the PDQ stuff, that's where I got more of the structuring of your module and how to piece them all together. And with all that information, I glued it all together to make just one coherent module.
Nice. That's fun because I even see the way you did the debugging verbose messages is pretty wise. So interesting stuff there. Do you remember, was there another module you saw that was like, oh, let me copy the way they generally structure things?
Yeah, so I saw the importing with dot sourcing
Yeah.
from Colby Booma's PDQ stuff module because I was learning to, hey, this is where the structure of /public is, where you go and find everything in that directory and dot source it.
Yep. So you put all
So
your
that,
functions in there and then make them available by kind of looping through that folder. Yeah.
yeah, and that's where I also majorly learned how to do dot sourcing entirely for later on in some of my other future projects that I have made that needed something like that.
Yeah. Well, that's awesome. Shout out Colby. The PTQ stuff module is pretty sick. And I feel like most people who go and create their first module, they always find another project that teaches them a lot of those things that they can borrow. So it's always cool to hear people's inspiration for that. Now, that's the cluster module. Is that the last module you wrote, or have you done another module since then?
I haven't really. So my plan is to make with Micah Shell, the jokingly protocol that I have sort of been toying with, to eventually make that its own module so you can interface directly with it in PowerShell. But I have to finish, making it work in the first place before I can wrap it all up in a module.
So how do you stay motivated to keep learning new things, especially when tackling difficult projects?
So usually someone will come to me with a problem or, boredom, mostly boredom. So when someone comes with me a problem I can't solve, I try my best to solve that problem, regardless of how difficult it may be, until I hit the wall of this is a totally unnecessary level of challenge. This is where we'll cut it. And the boredom is the greatest motivator, even in that. So if you get even bored of trying to solve those solutions, you try and make something different to theoretically solve that other problem.
Do you think there's a particular mindset required for learning by doing?
Uh,
Just curiosity, just got to be ready to kind of bang your head up just a little bit, enough to learn something.
Gotta have a little bit of patience. I know technology sometimes is kind of those frustrating things where you're just like, I want you to do this thing. Why are you not doing the thing I asked you to do? So having that kind of patience and logic that
Yeah.
I play factory games, so I get my logic of how do I glue all of this together. If I need this amount of thing at this time to make this thing here, how do I get from A to B in my problem solving? Because I don't care about the journey in between, because that's where I do all my learning. I have where I am and where I'm going, and I figure out how to get there.
Yeah. I see people struggle with being confused and not being okay with it. Because for me, I believe that some of the greatest growth you can have is when you are confused, a little bit above your skill level with where you are. And if you can stick there and ride it out, maybe connect a couple dots, that's where the real growth comes from. And it sounds like you're very comfortable with being in that spot. You have confidence that you're going to be able to make your way out of it, even if you don't see that line directly. And by doing that, you're able to try harder things and eventually connect all the dots and then be better for it.
Yeah. So like
Sweet.
in OpenGL, those things, you can't easily natively do that in PowerShell. So I just find something interesting to do and toy with it and eventually make my journey there.
What was the most rewarding part of putting together that cluster module?
The satisfaction that in my testing environment, if I needed to start expanding it, like if I wanted to start toying around with it, that I can do it in an easy way. So with my testing ground there, if I'm scaling things up to build a 17th copy of SCCM, I can just click a button and it should just start rolling what it needs, start creating the VMs it needs, and off it goes. So when it's ready, which it should be ready by now, when I in the future, get my own home lab set up and properly working, I can give access to a friend. They'd be like, hey, I need a game server. They click a couple buttons and out comes a virtual machine ready for them to get running as a game server.
What kind of game server you think they're going to ask you for?
Probably Minecraft.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
That's what my intentional design plan was people probably going to ask me for Minecraft servers.
Nice. So you're going to have the little rack in the closet. Nice. I don't know if you need that many resources for, I mean, I guess it depends on what mods you have, but nice. That's pretty fun. So you find this intersection of work, fun, you make it make sense for you. That is awesome. Now, have you dabbled with C# at all?
I have. After completing the MS cluster, I went to go start working on Micah Shell, the joke protocol that I was like, yeah, screw it. We'll see if I can do it so I can replace HTTP in my things. When I got through it, I got probably halfway there through after implementing the TLS version, the versioning of TLS. I ran into an issue where I'm maintaining two different PowerShell scripts for just two different functions. And I'm having to redefine a lot of that stuff in scripts where I can't make sure there's 100% no issues without fully testing it, like I can C#. So I've started learning C# so I can take some of what I've already written in that PowerShell, convert it into C# and make like a DLL that I can load in PowerShell, and then call PowerShell to handle the data that it knows how to do best and make it run better.
That is impressive. I'll say, your skills are pretty legit. To be curious and to be diving into those types of things so soon is pretty impressive to me. Now, are there any specific PowerShell commands or patterns that helped you better understand C#'s concepts?
I have to say, probably starting to toy around with just the .NET stuff in PowerShell. Like, there's some commandlets like, your get child item where you pipe it to things and you do your dot properties or you do your new objects for whatever. But most of the time, it's really just that intermediary stage where you're in PowerShell loading .NET to get those kind of two things to glue together to make those kind of commandlets yourself.
Nice. So you're in Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code? A little bit of both?
I use both. So I use Visual Studio Code. That was my original IDE. So that's where I used all my PowerShell. And I tried using C# in there, but it's a little not really fully there. It feels like it's kind of like a little half baked to get C# working in Visual Studio. So I have Visual Studio Code. So I just use Visual Studio because I click 3 buttons and out comes my project in the ways that I need them. So I use both most of the time simultaneously when I'm writing these kind of things.
So VS Code is your first? You didn't dabble with the ISE at all?
I did originally when I was first learning PowerShell, mess with the ISE, but with there being no dark mode or whatever, it hurts my eyes after a little while.
All right, that's a good justification. Hey, everybody, I know it's deprecated and all these other reasons not to use the ISE, but it also doesn't have dark mode, so...
Yeah, it was also just, it feels a little clunkier to use sometimes, like when you have the wall of all the commandlets, you get lost, just like, I don't know what I'm doing with any of these. So when you do something like Visual Studio Code, where you have to explicitly open that kind of window, and you'll have to go through that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I'll say, if you really do love the ISE, first of all, I've been telling you to get on VS Code forever, so what are you doing? But if you really like it, guess what? Open up VS Code, press F1, type in ISE, and just use PowerShell ISE mode. I think that's what it's called. And it'll change. Yeah, it gives you a command thing you're used to, whatever. It'll look similar. You'll be good to go. But it's worth using.
It hurts my eyes, definitely, when I first saw that one.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the good old dark mode versus light mode. Clearly, I know where you stand in that. But you've also been able to get started with VS Code, and now you can use it for other things as well, right? You don't only do PowerShell in VS Code.
No, I do sometimes some HTML, some PHP, Markdown, things like that.
Yeah. Markdown. Speaking of which, yeah. Yeah, we're trying to, you do have a blog, which I'm happy to see. I encouraged you to get started with that a while ago. But I think, you're doing a GitHub Pages blog right now. And I think we're at the point where you need to get a good template to use.
Yeah, so then, I got bored last night. So I was like, you know what? Might as well give it a shot in anticipation for this, podcast thing. So I wrote it up, realized browsers don't like Markdown. And so if you actually go to the page, you just get a nice raw Markdown file.
Yeah. And there's some good Markdown renderers you can use in VS Code, some linting helpers, and all kinds of cool stuff. So maybe later today we'll get together and look at some of that. Get you a nice fancy blog. And you know what, everybody, if it's fancy or not, there will be a link in the show notes to go check out Micah's lovely blog. And I read your first post. Was it formatted right? No, it was just raw markdown, but it worked.
I just sent it and went from there. I know it's only going to get better from there.
Dude, knowing that is so important. So many people can get lost with trying to make everything perfect and do it everything right the first try. That's usually not how life works, especially when this isn't your job to write a blog, right? It's just something you're doing to grow and to connect and all kinds of cool stuff like that. So have you listened to the podcast before? And just a heads up, I've asked you this already, so I know the answer. It feels kind of weird to do, but have you listened to the podcast before?
I do sometimes whenever I could, find a minute to breathe. So I don't get all too often to watch them. Last one I think I watched was, I think it was one of Josh's, and then also
nice.
the Jeffrey Snover ones. I think the Snover one is pretty much all I've had the ability to watch. So I find time where I can to get those watched.
Yeah. So tell me about this Snover one though, because apparently you used it in some class or something.
Yeah. So in college, I had a speech class where you learned how to speak better. So in one of these things I had to do for that class was a second presentation. So I did my second presentation on PowerShell. Now, thankfully, the week I was starting to work on this and make PowerShell, the episode for Snover came out. So a lot of what you and Snover talked about were a great inspiration and helped me make the flow of my PowerShell presentation even better, where I used some of the pictures from that episode in my slideshow, reference the episode itself, so that way people, if they were curious, could go back and learn the proper actual history of PowerShell instead of my abbreviated version.
You're giving them a little tour of the history of PowerShell. Nice.
Yep. So I used Snover's thing to give history and the basics of just PowerShell.
So it sounds like early on in your career, your dad gave you some good mentoring and kind of set the stage for what a successful IT career could look like. Is that pretty fair to say?
Yeah. So that's how I was mostly exposed to PowerShell and deploying inventory. Was my father would take me to work here and there, give me time to learn. I'd ask him questions. Sometimes I'd be the fresh brain for these kind of weird problems that sometimes you may have overlooked. So it was definitely a good experience seeing, hey, we need to do this. Let me make sure the documentation is correctly understood and things like that. Or if something's going wrong, what is its true evil gremlin that it's trying to explain?
Do you see yourself eventually mentoring others in PowerShell like you were mentored early on?
I've tried to teach my coworkers PowerShell. It's whenever we have time for the most part. So, like I have the coworker Morgan. I've exposed him to a little bit of PowerShell. He tried it for a little bit. I don't think he's really experimented with it all too much because he doesn't have that end goal like I usually do for that learning process. So I have not a clue. No clue how far he's gotten into it, but I made attempts.
Well, and honestly, just by doing a blog too, it gives you an opportunity to indirectly mentor others and help them along their journeys without even having to say hi to them. So 2 birds with 1 scone right there. You can feed 2 of them. What's your dream project or goal as you continue on your PowerShell journey? Do you have any big challenges that you want to tackle one day?
It mostly just comes by here to see what kind of difficult things I'm trying to make. So right now with the C# and PowerShell road, to get PowerShell more used, like some of my servers, some of my applications are nothing but PowerShell. So making sure I have the tooling to maintain, support, make sure they're still alive, even keep that PowerShell river flowing, so I can build tools that last and hopefully no one will ever have to deprecate.
Building tools that last. Yeah, that is. I think that was like maybe on my blog bio or whatever. It's like, I love building tools that last, because that is, if you take the right approach, they really can last and outlive you. And I kind of geek out on a lot of the efficiency that comes with writing PowerShell, including the efficiency of the solutions I'm writing here are going to outlive me. And I still hear from previous coworkers who are talking about scripts or modules that I've written that they're still using regularly. And I personally really enjoy that because as someone with skills like you, it's important to leave as much of a, I mean, for me at least, it's important to leave a positive impact everywhere you go. Just because you can use your skills for good or you can use them in sort of a self-serving way. And one leads to more success. The other one is going to lead to more sadness. So I try and go that approach. But you seem really comfortable with languages, right? You said PHP, you said PowerShell, C#. Do you have any desire to go the more development route with your career at all?
I love technology way too much to just pinpoint myself to one location where I love solving these technical problems. So I see myself more as the good old true sysadmin where I'm solving 15 and one problems at once with automation and stuff like that.
Nice. That's cool. It definitely helps. How has learning C# influenced the way you write PowerShell? Has it changed it at all?
Not really, because the flow of it, for the most part, is almost the same. Just some of the syntax is a little different, but I don't deal with the curly brackets being on the wrong line for my liking in PowerShell, so it saves me that trouble.
Is there any area of PowerShell or IT in general that you're eager to explore but haven't had a chance to yet?
More tooling is what I'm looking at. It's like some of the tooling, like the Windows presentation forms. Like I've seen people who have GUIs for printers or whatever, doing more of those web request kind of handlings and scraping things like that, where I can give someone a GUI. Hey, what's the status of a printer? What's wrong with it? They click 3 buttons and it gives them a very detailed list about what they can do with it.
Oh, what about a TUI? You know what that is?
A terminal user interface? Oh, yeah.
Dude, those are sick. I'm gonna have another episode on those in the coming up weeks, but gosh, there's some really cool projects. There's a C# project called Spectre.console that has been wrapped into a PowerShell project called PWSH Spectre.console, which is really sick, and it's an easy way to create TUIs, which you may enjoy. So I recommend checking out that episode when it comes out, or just check out Spectre Console.
Yeah,
It's
'cause I
pretty
know
sweet.
I've experienced with the TUI because in my module, if you pass the restart, or if you uh, like stop starting here, if you pass like get cluster node into out terminal grid view, you can select which nodes, and then you can pipe it to restart cluster node, and based on the object it receives, it will go attempt to go restart the node.
Out console grid view is a sick command. Yeah, that is
Yeah,
nice. It's a
I
nice,
just
easy way to make TUIs.
I just needed the selectability more of the terminal GUI that was better into my terminal instead of spawning a different GUI. You could click buttons and then click back in your PowerShell window and help you catch any errors in time.
How'd you hear about that module?
Uh, Console upgrade from mostly the PDQ Discord where people
Okay.
use it all the time.
Yeah, it's pretty
Didn't you,
fun.
didn't you do an episode on that as
Yes.
well? Then that's
Yeah.
also where I learned most of it was from your episode.
Yeah, I'm just wondering because I like this stuff. So it's always cool to hear other people who are into TUIs just a little bit.
Yeah,
Just those easy wins in PowerShell where it's like, if you don't know about it, you don't know about the easy win. But once you do know about it, that's an easy W, baby. We like
yeah.
those.
I watched that episode like 3 times to find the command that you called to make it that terminal user interface because that's where that section from my module really ended up was how do I get this to look like what someone else has got?
Yeah, nice. So you may have a front end, some dabbling with interfaces in your future. That's cool.
As long as I don't have to stare at my get phrase GUI any more than I do, I think I'll be golden.
Are you on Windows PowerShell or PowerShell 7 mostly?
I've been mostly moving on to PowerShell 7 because I know I use some 5, but I mostly just when I'm needing to do something in PowerShell, I just summon 7 because 7 has saved my behind countless times more than 5 could.
Really? With what? What
Yep.
type of commands?
So in deploy, I was attempting to get the ability for deploy to go add printers to devices, as you know that those are kind of really touchy with how they want to be added if it's in user or computer space, wherever it feels like it sometimes. In PowerShell 5, the add printer, if you give it a network location, would just not work for me. It would just say, yep, I'm adding but it would never actually call to go pull down the driver or things like that. In PowerShell 7, when I run my deploy pack, I can tell it's working because its length is way longer than 5 was, and it actually does add the printer. So I've had to use 7 in some of those weird cases where 5 has started to fail me.
Interesting. Yeah, there's definitely some advantages. I'm not familiar with those ones because I try and avoid printers at all costs. Which honestly, I didn't know that printers were hated by everyone. And I'm pretty sure it's because my coworkers were gaslighting me. Like my old boss, I didn't know the IT community didn't like printers. He always acted like they were so normal and would just make it so I'd have to do all the stuff with them. But it turns out most people hate printers.
Yeah, I mean, if they had a sensible, communication with them or things like that, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But they don't like to play, so
Yep. So if my old boss is ever listening to this, Mike, I know what you did. And you're welcome for handling those dang printers. Oh, man. Has anything ever gone wrong with your PowerShell scripts where you're like, oh, crap, I shouldn't have done that? Ever bit you?
Oh yeah. So I took in our staff creation script. So we have a script that would generate the 80 accounts for staff members, whatever, do what it needed to do to them. So it used some older PowerShell where, like, in new objects, you use the backtick to go down a line, things like that. So I took that script and rewrote it where everything was in this own separate function. So if Microsoft or someone changes something in there, you can just change the one function without having to dig through a whole really long file. In there for home drives and things like that, I've had to use iCals. So, what happens when you ask iCals to go change the security permissions on a DFS root folder that you forgot that the ending of the file path doesn't exist, and so it points straight to your DFS roots folder? All your security permissions disappear, so everyone just kind of grinds to a halt.
Oh, boy. So no one even has read or anything like that?
Even if you clicked on it and you clicked advanced and administrator, there was nothing, not even system. There was no permission.
Oh, my. So you jacked that up. Did you fix it?
Yeah, so I had to actually take own, and then all the security permissions came back with it. And then I made sure those iCals lines were commented out to never see the light of day in case someone else needed to implement these 2 legacy folders that I was trying to kill off.
Oh my gosh. Well, that's stressful. Also, the backticks thing, what's up with that? We don't do that anymore, do we?
I don't do backticks for new objects. I literally just do new line and it just goes down.
Have you heard of splatting?
I do in some things like VM creations, I do splatting. Like I do the $sign parameters and do the @ sign and all the things, the stuff on the command parameters that I want, and then I feed that to it.
Okay. Just making sure that you knew about splatting. It's there for you if you need it. Yeah, splatting is pretty sweet. What is one tip you have for someone just getting started in PowerShell? Maybe they're just get fresh out of college, haven't done much. Maybe they know it's cool. What advice do you have for them?
I'd say probably toy with it so you can learn some basic syntax. But if you get lost, try to find something to build. Like if you want a script that goes and creates 80 users, if you have Windows 10, 11 Pro, you can go install Hyper-V and build the domain controller and start playing around with all the other RSATs, all the server things to see how they kind of run and see what kind of weird and quirky things you can build with that kind of thing.
In your PowerShell journey, was there any time where you were just kind of like, I'm overwhelmed, I don't want to do this anymore, and just kind of took a break for a little bit, stepped away from maybe pursuing your growth?
Yeah, that was mostly in like those web requests. So, like I had a coworker who was leaving, so I tried to build like a WebEx scraper so I could go get all of our messages of all of our all the documentation we had chatted with each other hadn't just disappeared into the void. Yeah, I got kind of in there, but all of their examples are in curl. So trying to translate that kind of curl to invoke web request is kind of one of those monumental kind of things. I got so lost, I kind of just killed it off entirely.
Yeah, I can relate to that. It can be kind of challenging. Are you more familiar with web requests now?
Somewhat, but that's mostly for the things that I make. If it's still like some third-party cloud provider or some other application, I'm lost if they give me curl examples.
Have you dabbled with invoke rest method at all yet?
I have a little bit, but that is still like one of those colossal walls you look at, you stare at this and go, I don't know how to make any of this do what I want.
Yeah, I agree with that. The first time you interact and try and figure out REST APIs, it can be a bit challenging. But once you get it, oh my gosh, there's a whole new world out there of things you can do. So I recommend maybe crossing that off the checklist someday. And I'm happy to work on it with you because I love talking about invoke rest method, especially in PowerShell 7. It's a lot better in PowerShell 7. And shout out to Mark Krause for writing those commands. Those are community contributions. So that's pretty sweet. I remember back when PowerShell Core 6.0 came out, the name we don't talk about anymore. Yeah, it was pretty exciting to see all those enhancements that were made. I actually wrote a chapter about invoke rest method, where I really had to dive deep and learn all the intricacies and authentication methods, which was my almost walking away moment. Authentication can be a little challenging, especially the first time you try and figure it out. But tools like maybe Fiddler or things like that can show you actually what's being sent can be insightful with that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think most of the difficulty with those kind of invoke rest messages, where do I store my keys to the kingdom? And how do I make sure that what I'm doing is not leaving my OpenAI key in my GitHub repo?
Yep. Yeah, definitely don't want to do that. I always recommend using secure strings for those as well whenever you can and decrypting them only as needed. But yeah, there's some thought that needs to be put into that. No plain text passwords, please, people. Whether it's in scripts, wherever it is, avoid plain text passwords at all costs. It can, and it often does bite people badly. So definitely want to avoid that. If there's anything you take away from this podcast, that's the one that'll save you the most. No plain text passwords, please.
Unless it's like a standard user that has the permission of, I can access this one file and that's it.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Awesome, Micah. Well, I have some challenging questions for you. You've done very well so far, and I appreciate the insight you've given. I feel like I know you better now. I don't know if we've ever chatted this long. I think we have, but not like just you and I. I think there's been other people chatting with us.
Yeah.
Question number 1. What is one time something went wrong while on the job? How did you handle it, and what did you learn? The iCals thing kind of sounds like it fits that bill.
Yeah, the iCals thing is one of those good examples. Or messing with RoboCopy, where I accidentally deleted the entirety of the IT department's home drives off one of our servers because I hit the mirror switch by accident and everything went poof. We're trying to clean up some of our servers.
Yikes. What'd you learn for next time, though?
To not touch RoboCopy unless I absolutely have to. And if I do, to avoid the mirror step or parameter, so I don't just delete everything on the other side.
That's a good one. Fair enough. With your knowledge now, what one tip would you give your younger self when first starting in IT?
Make sure you get armed with deploy and inventory so you leverage those PowerShell things so you can build those massive, expansive things.
Yeah, I agree with that. If you were in charge of devices, you got to get those devices managed with as much automation as possible so you can free yourself up to tackle the rest of your responsibilities. Because most of us have many of them.
Yeah.
And PowerShell is part of that because it's going to be what's able to free up even more of your time. You have to invest that initial time, but once you do, you are able to be a force multiplier across your whole organization, which is just love seeing it. Nice, good job, security there.
Yeah, like those, like in Okta, where you can't support, hey, I need the user to change their password next log on. So you build something that generates passphrases so you don't have one universal password to every new user or people who forget their passwords. You just run a thing, get a phrase, reset them, and tell them, and off they go.
Yep. Okay, cool. What are 3 of your favorite modules?
PDQ stuff.
That's one word, everybody. I know. PDQ stuff.
Say PS Windows updates, that saved me a bunch. And then the Dell BIOS provider.
Oh boy, you like that one? I've
Yes,
heard mixed reviews.
It's hit and miss sometimes, but sometimes when you're doing things like trying to set BIOS passwords or remote imaging, like an SCCM, if I need to image something, I got to tell it to Pixie boot. And that's, for the most part, a manual process of restart the machine, spam F12, tell it to Pixie boot, and hope SCCM responds. But with the Dell BIOS provider, I can do things like in deploy. I can tell a machine remotely, set your boot order, restart, and off it goes.
Okay, now that's an interesting use case. I'll have to follow up with you off air to explore that a little bit. Sounds like that might be helpful to other people with Dell and their environment.
Except for when Dell decides to add or remove a space on a network card name and it gets a little confused.
Off by one. I love those errors. Awesome. Well, Micah, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you, everyone out there, for listening. Drive safe, walk safe, run safe. Whatever you're doing, do it safely. I am Andrew Tech. This is Micah Shonyo. And your dad's name is Mike, right?
Yep.
Okay. My middle name is Michael. So, we're like basically family. But Micah, people enjoyed what they heard today. They want to connect with you. They want to see you flourish and grow in your PowerShell and IT career. Where can we find you on the World Wide Web?
So I don't use social media much. So there's only two places you can easily find me. I am Saint Satan 69 on Discord, usually browsing around in the PDQ Discord as Lord Micah the Influencer. Or my GitHub is Saint Satan 69, and that's where I post pretty much anything I have made, for the most part, that I've figured I can use source control on.
Micah, you're a saint. And we'll leave it at that, man. Thank you, everyone out there. Check us out on the PDQ Discord, discord.gg/PDQ, and links to everything we talked about will be in the show notes. Have a great week.
Thanks for listening to the PowerShell Podcast. The PowerShell Podcast is a PDQ production, making device management simple, secure, and pretty damn quick.